This is March the 3rd, 1995. I am interviewing my wife, Muriel F. Foster, or Muriel Foster Ross, about her grandmother, Margaret Runyon Foster. And the Runyon is spelled R-U-N-I-O-N. Muriel, could you tell me a little bit about the early history of your grandmother?
My grandmother was born in the area of Spivey Mountain, what is now Unicoi County, Tennessee, on October the 12th, 1854. This was pre-Civil War years, and my first experience with her came when I was born March 2nd, 1929. My mother died 2 days after I was born, and she took over the care for me until I was 6 years old. That's one reason I'm very concerned that she received recognition for what she did, not only for me but other members of their family. And she was a true pioneer woman.
Can you tell me a little bit about her ancestry?
Margaret was part Cherokee. We're not too sure about just who was the first Runyon. When I was a child in Greenville, South Carolina, they said that she was half Cherokee and that her father was a Cherokee Indian. Later, when I moved up here, another relative said that she was really the daughter of William Runyon, who had married a Cherokee woman. We're not sure whether the Cherokee woman was her mother or another generation or so back. Very little information is given on the Runyons. We're not sure about that, except there may have been some racial problems because of the Cherokee. They were at one time sent on what's the so-called Trail of Tears to Arkansas and Oklahoma, and many of those with Cherokee blood ran into the hills and hid out so they would not be taken away. In later life, the government apparently was making reparations to the Cherokees. I don't know whether by land or money, but they called them to come in or wrote them to come in and make claims. Grandma would never do it, though the children encouraged her to do it. And we think it was probably out of fear that once again they would be persecuted in some way. And for this reason, we feel that she would never talk much about her ancestry. We have not been able to go any farther back with the Runyons than her father. Her father, William Runyon, was a scout for the Union side of the Civil War. He apparently had been away from home for quite a while and came in one day to see his family, and possibly someone reported him being in the area, or the Confederate soldiers were nearby, so they came to capture him, but he escaped out the back door, ran up the mountain behind the cabin, and my grandmother, who was about 12, and her little brother was about 8, and they saw him killed. Margaret Runyon's, her mother was left a widow, and I was told that her husband's brother cheated them out of their land. Later, her brother became a blacksmith, and he did have quite a bit of land in the Temple Hill area of Irwin or Unicoi County. He married a woman who came from the Parks family, original pioneers in that area. At that time, the Cherokee Indians were still coming into the area, and they visited their home quite often. And she read the Bible to them. Margaret married William K. Foster, who was the son of Can Foster. Can,
how do you spell can?
K-A-N, and it was apparently a misspelling for Kennedy, and they spelled it K-A-N-A-D-Y. But she was 24 years old when she married William, or Uncle Billy, as they called him in later life. She married him on March 31st, 1878. But to go back a little farther in the history, Can Foster was the son of William Rigsby, or R-I-G-S-B-Y, also called Regesby, R-E-G-E-S-B-Y. And this was the father of the clan. And William Rigsby was born in 1758. He died in 1840. His mother, Anne, married a man they called Old Tom Foster, and he was a soldier in the United States Cavalry at the time of the Indian Wars. And Old Tom Foster adopted William. And William married his first wife in Bluegrass, Kentucky. He had lived as a boy in the Unicoi County area, and he escaped an Indian massacre which killed the Lewis family, and that was in the area of what they call Granny's Creek. It's Granny Lewis's Creek. And he managed to make it to the stockade, and the rest of the family were murdered by the Indians. This story is told in a poem by Roxy Masters in her book called The Valley of the Long Hunters. She also wrote a poem called The Brave Men. I think it's in the same book. It tells about his son Can, K-A-N, and Can came back from Kentucky with his father and the wife and other children, and he was the one that cleared the land, mountain land, and built a cabin. In 1839, he received a grant of 640 acres up on Spivey Mountain. Now, he was a hunter, he was a scout, he tilled the land, he was a trader and a trapper. I've heard stories of him going down to Jonesboro to trade. And his story is told by a David Hunter Strother, S-T-R-O-T-H-E-R. This was in Harper's New Monthly Magazine in January 1858, volume XVI. The magazine had the story and drawings by this man that was an artist, and the unnamed son that went with his father to find horses for these men was apparently my grandfather, who married my grandmother Margaret.
This was the person that they referred to as Uncle Billy.
Right. And
so
I was told by,
and he married Margaret in
right,
19 when
18,
18 and
78. Yes, 1878.
1878.
Yes.
And where did they live?
Well, for a number of years, I think till the children were almost grown, they lived in Unicoi County. But when the children were at least teenage, they moved to the Limestone, Tennessee area, a farm near Limestone. They rented a few farms until they got enough money to buy the 25-acre farm, which is still in the family. One of my cousins owns it.
Now, that's a Telford, Tennessee
Well,
address
that's
today.
the mailing address, but it is near Limestone, about 4 or 5 miles from Limestone.
And what did he do when he got there?
When he moved to Limestone, he farmed. He one of the neighbors told me that he came with 2 head of oxen, and apparently they did the pulling and helped with the plowing and whatever. She also told me there was a time when my grandfather had been accused, William, had been accused of stealing a cow. And in those days that was pretty critical. You could be hung for such a thing. And she said it was later proven that he did not steal the cow.
Okay. Now, what was Grandma Margaret doing during this time? She was having children, or?
Yes, she had about 7 children. Let me see. She let me see. I got names down here somewhere. Her oldest daughter was Mary Luella, and she was called Lula. And when she was 16, she ran away from home and married a man who later became was a gambler and a womanizer. They didn't hear from her for a number of years, and that was a heartbreak to them.
Where was she then?
We don't know. Later in life, I did hear that she did have to move around quite a bit, and she did come home one time when a couple of her children were up 7 or 8 years old.
Well, was this man that she married, was he from a circus, or?
Well, he apparently lived up in the mountains somewhere. I don't know too much about him.
We don't know what he had been doing, if anything.
No, I don't. But she was the aunt who became my foster parent from the time I was 16 years old until I was 18. Her oldest child was 8 months older than Grandma's youngest daughter. She and my grandmother did not get along very well. But Aunt Lula always talked very warmly of Grandpa. It was interesting that she and her family did not look like the Foster Runyon families, and they didn't have the same temperament. So I'm wondering if there's some things that happened it's another thing that we did not talk about in the family. Then she had a son, James, who was born in 1880. Born in October and died in December. Had William Marion, who was born in 1882, and one Loretta, a little girl, in 1884.
And that was L-O-R-E-T-T-A?
Loretta, but they called her Reddy.
R-E-D-D-Y?
Pardon?
R-E-D-D-Y?
R-E-T-T-Y, Reddy.
Okay, R-E-T-T-Y.
Now, she was born in 1884, and she died 2 years later in 1886. A son, Bernie, was born in 1887. A little girl, Creasy was born in 1890, and she died 3 years later in 1893. My father, Samuel, was born in 1893, and the youngest child was Lydia Matilda, or Tildy, was born March 8th, 1896. And I don't know, but these mothers did nurse their children for quite a while, and perhaps it was a means of birth control, but there was usually at least 2 years between the babies. And another thing that I noticed, that in the mountain areas, the children did die very young.
It seems to me like there's a common denominator there, that in all three of those deaths, there was something like 2 years, 2 or 3 years
They were still
old.
very young.
2 or 3 years old.
And of course, we had the coldness. We had the weather conditions. One thing in the story written about her husband, or her husband's father, Can Foster, the photographer that came out of New York to get a story and get pictures. There's a picture in the magazine issue that showed the inside of the cottage, and they called it the main cottage, so apparently a cabin. Apparently there was more than one cabin, but the cabin had a long room, and it served as a living room, but at one end there was this large fireplace where they cooked, and this was in the middle of the winter, and when they walked in, Can and his wife were skinning a wild hog, and they had the cabin door open. In the room they had 2 beds at the other corner of the room, and had a rocking chair there. They had straight back chairs, cane bottoms. They had homemade chairs or tables, and he was telling about the wife, the type of work that she did, which is, I'm sure, the type of work that my grandmother did, because I can remember her doing some of the things. But they were telling that the mother of the family made the clothing. She was weaving. She fashioned the patterns, and she did sort of a patching type of sewing. No sewing machine. They just learned to patch. And I can remember Grandma taking something and using real fine little stitches, and it was very strong. The clothing didn't come apart too easily. There was a daughter that was the oldest daughter. She, of course, was being trained by her mother, and she would fetch things for her mother. She helped her pick and lift pots off the fire. She also had to help take care of the younger children. These women were often left alone. Can Foster, as I say, was a trader, and he'd go up into the mountains. They cut trees, and they had herbs and things like that they got out of the mountains and go down to Jonesboro to trade.
They were selling...
Well, whatever the mountains had that they wanted. I don't know whether it's... Well, they probably trapped animals, and I just don't really know all that too well. But the women were left alone, and their job, of course, to take care of the home. They did the gardening. They drew water from the springs. They had to carry the water in. They didn't have wells at that time. They cut the wood. The men cut the trees down, but the women had to cut the wood and take in for the fireplace. Obviously, they bore and raised the children, and mostly without the help of the men, because the men were having to get out and work in the forest and the clearing and trading or whatever else they had to do. These children only got a year or two of schooling, if any at all. I don't believe Grandma Margaret could read or write. William may have been able to write some. I never saw him do anything like that. Now the children, they lived there in the forest, and they played in the forest. Now the picture that the artist drew, they were sitting there on the bare floor of the cabin, and they were playing around the beds and some little games that they knew. But when they could get out, they built playhouses in the rocks, and they used the little acorns for cups, and they had the snail shells that they would play house with. They made dams across the creeks. They hunted and fished, gathered nuts, and they made pets of squirrels, and they collected bird eggs. So that was a little bit, I'm sure, the same life that Grandma had to live. And of course, her father was dead, and she was 12 years old. Her brother was about 8 at that time. And there was another baby that I think I finally traced that he died as a baby. But she probably had a very hard life, that they had to get out and really work the land or whatever they had to do in order to even survive. And so in a way, I think she probably came up quite a bit in life when she did marry into the foster family.
Merle, your grandmother appeared to be a very self-sufficient person.
Yes, I think her Cherokee upbringing, she was able to learn quite a bit from them, because they were still coming in, and then the fact that she was closely related to them, and I suspect that they did come in and help her mother and the little boy, because he was a hunter before he became the landowner and the blacksmith. They were self-supporting in that they would gather the herbs and the nuts in the forest. They loved fishing, and so the trout were plentiful at that time in the mountain streams. They used fish to fertilize the gardens and animal manure. As an old woman, she continued to raise her garden. She canned and dried her vegetables and fruits for winter. They slaughtered hogs to make sausage and lard, cured ham. They cured the ham in the smokehouse. I think these hard years made her a good wife, a helpful wife to her husband, because they worked together quite well.
So there was plenty to do for.
She worked all the time when I knew her. Of course, she had a child under 6 years old, and that was enough. She was 78 when I went to live with her.
Merle, you described a main cabin. Were there other cabins attached to this cabin?
I don't know about the attachment of the cabin, but they did have 9 children, and there was a cabin mentioned in the story about Ken Foster that was called the sleeping cabin. They put their guests in there, and I assume that the other children slept in there. Possibly it had a dog trot to that other cabin, and I think it got the name because they kept the kitchen in one cabin and took the foods over to the other cabin in case of fire. They could perhaps get the fire put out in that cabin before it got to the other one. And I gather the dogs trotted in between the 2 cabins. I really don't know. There was always a danger of fire. And I can remember even the house down in Limestone catching on fire once or twice because of the soot getting up into the chimney and catching on fire. Ken, as I mentioned, and his wife had 9 children. They also had a grain mill there. I think it was called a tub mill, and some of the neighbors came to bring their corn, and they'd bring their corn in sacks and pillowcases, and then they'd sit around talking while the corn was being ground. Sometimes they'd take out a fiddle and play it, and they'd visit with the wife and the children, so activities seemed to be going on there most of the time.
Muriel, what are your personal how do you remember your grandmother from your time that you were 6 or 7 years old?
Well, I knew my grandmother almost from the second day I was born, but my memories didn't start until I was about 2 years old. And one of my earliest memories was going with my grandmother to Irwin, and we were in a log cabin. I was placed in a large rocking chair surrounded by pillows, and across the room was this bed, and a very elderly man was lying there. There was a window beside his bed, and I watched my grandmother talking with him, and it was a cold, rainy day outside, cloudy day, and I remember watching her and looking out the window. Apparently I had been taught to sit very quietly because I did not run up and down like many children do today. And I learned later that was her brother, William Runyon. She had gone to visit him for the last time, and I was a little over 2 years old when he died. My grandmother was an elderly woman when I knew her. She was 78 when she came to take care of me. She had Indian features. Her hair was long. She wore it bald up in the back. It's sort of a steel gray. She'd sit and rock me, and I can remember she was a very wrinkled lady, and I just loved to play with her hands and pull the wrinkles up and play with them. She nursed me through whooping cough and diphtheria, both. I can remember the earache, screaming with them, and once she had a neighbor come from across the street, a woman who smoked, and she blew smoke into my ears. I ended up with a damaged right ear. She nursed my father when he was at home, and oftentimes he was at the VA hospital because of the tuberculosis. She cared for my grandfather, who had asthma very badly. In fact, I remember his death, that I woke up one night in a different bed from where I slept, and first thing I did was go look for my grandparents. And I went into the room where they slept, and he was lying there, and they had pennies on his eyes. They were closed, and I was trying to get the pennies off and trying to talk to him, asking him why I heard voices in the other room. After that, we moved back to Limestone, to their farmhouse, and my daddy by that time was pretty critically ill. My aunt, her youngest daughter, had moved to the house with her husband. He was quite ill with rheumatoid arthritis. My father was dying of tuberculosis, and the women did most of the work in caring for all of us. Aunt Tildy had 5 or 6 children by that time, and so Grandma and she had to do the farm work and care for the sick and the children. Limestone, the house is still standing in Limestone, and I'll describe that a little bit to you. The house still stands, as I said, and it has a front and side porch. The side porch was next to a large garden, and down below that was an orchard. In the back was a smokehouse. The hams were smoked in there and were preserved and kept. The house on the side porch had a cistern that caught the rainwater. At the front part of the side porch was a door leading down to a dirt cellar that they stored the potatoes and apples and other foods for the winter. You entered the front door of the house, and at that time there was a stairway going up to the attic, and rooms were on either side, and at that time everything was a bedroom. Didn't
This is tape 1, side B. Muriel, would you like to continue with the discussion of your grandmother?
Yes. I was describing the house on the other side. There were 4 rooms downstairs. There was no living room as such. The 2 front rooms were both bedrooms. Aunt Tildy and Uncle Okie slept in the 1 bedroom, and Daddy and Grandma and I slept in the other bedroom. The 5 boys slept upstairs in an unfinished attic. It was a very chilly, open house. We heated with wood in a big stove in Aunt Tildy and Uncle Okie's room. And I remember once or twice the house caught on fire. It was a very frightening thing, and usually it was due to the chimney needing to be cleaned out. Back of the 2 bedrooms was a dining room with a large wooden table and benches and chairs at either end, and then a little area of the kitchen where the wood cook stove was used. And they did not have the water inside. You had to go outside to bring the water up from the cistern. We had a very large family there. At one time, Aunt Tildy said at least 13 people lived in the farmhouse. These were Depression years. Grandma and Aunt Tildy put away a lot of the fruits. We had a large orchard to one side. We had apples and peaches and pears and cherries and let's see, there were grape arbors. We had walnuts and hickories on the farm. Very self-sufficient place. They also had a large garden, and Grandma and Aunt Tildy dried fruits for delicious fruit pies, and they had chickens running around in the yard. We had in the garden we had corn, beans, onions, tomatoes, potatoes, sweet potatoes, turnips, cabbage, and peas. And they canned with these wire-top jars. I can barely remember that. The table was always, in the summertime, loaded down with food. And you could go in any time to fix yourself a biscuit or some bread and jelly. Had all sorts of jams and jellies. In the winter, in the evening, I can remember all of us sitting around the table, and a lot of times we'd have mush and milk. I don't know whether we just didn't have the food, or we had eaten better at lunchtime. I just can't remember all that. But they had a barn, had a cow, we had the milk, There was a horse there called Old May. I remember asking my grandfather one time why he didn't have any hair on top of his head, and he said Old May bit him. And I don't know if that's true or not. Well, Old May apparently did bite him, but I don't think that had anything to do with his baldness. Grandma and Grandpa are buried out in the Oakland Cemetery, about a mile from the house, the old Oakland Presbyterian Church. And the family tradition still goes on in that area. One of the grandsons owns the farm that they had.
Muriel, do you want to give a final summary?
Thank you. Yes. In summary of this interview, I'd like to point out that this turned out to be not just the history of Margaret Runyon Foster, but of all the women of the Foster-Runyon clan. Margaret was the daughter-in-law of Can Foster and his unnamed wife. Can's mother was the original pioneer who came with her husband, William Rigsby Foster, to Tennessee from Kentucky. It has been nearly impossible to learn anything about Margaret because of her Cherokee heritage, but the daily activities of the two unnamed Foster women and their families were the same activities Margaret Foster and her daughters were doing when I was born. Margaret was a closed-mouthed, hard-working woman who was already almost deaf and was becoming more blind when she came to care for me at the age of 78. She had spent a lifetime caring for the sick, delivering babies, and working along beside her husband, raising 3 sons and 2 daughters. She instilled the same traits of living your Christian principles, hard work, and determination in her daughters and granddaughters. Hilda, her youngest daughter, cared for my father and me until his death. Her husband grossly crippled with rheumatoid arthritis until his death, and her Margaret mother until her death, all within a period of 3 years, while feeding and caring for 5 boys and 2 girls. She and her sons farmed a 25-acre farm until 2 of the boys went into service during World War II. They did this without the aid of Social Security. They raised tobacco, milked a cow, raised chickens and hogs, and planted and put away garden and fruit produce. After the children were grown, she helped care for her grandchildren, helped with sick relatives, and helped neighbors with farm work. When she retired and moved to Chester Inn, she continued her services to others and at the senior citizens in Jonesboro, and visiting nursing homes in the area. Margaret's oldest daughter took me into her home when I was 6 until I was 18. Though things were hard for me, I now understand how hard it must have been for a 50-year-old woman to have taken a child that did not want to be there any more than she wanted me to be there. The thing is, she did care for me despite her own personal problems. Another heroine was Velda Metcalf Runyon, my mother's sister, who took me into her home when I was 20 and encouraged me to get an education, though she had only a 3rd-grade education herself. She had a severely retarded daughter whom she cared for at home until Veldy, died. She supported herself by quilting, gardening, raising chickens and a hog, milking a cow, and when I knew her, she had a little one-room store where she sold the basics to the neighbors and snack food to the children at the school up the road. She managed to give me money when I was at East Tennessee State. She was so proud of me. I was the first and only child in my generation on both sides of the family to complete college. This is my thanks to all the women who came before me